On April 28, 2025, Mark Carney delivered a speech that signaled a fundamental structural shift in Canada's international and economic positioning. Addressing a room of supporters, the former central banker declared that the long-standing trade and diplomatic arrangement with the United States is no longer just being renegotiated or paused, but is effectively finished. This declaration comes in the wake of a national vote that endorsed this new direction, moving the country away from decades of traditional bilateral cooperation toward a more independent and sovereign posture on the world stage. The catalyst for this shift can be traced back to January 2025, when the Trump administration implemented a 25% tariff on Canadian goods entering the United States via executive order. While the U.S. government cited border security and fentanyl trafficking as the primary justifications, the move created a direct economic squeeze on a trade relationship valued at approximately 900 billion Canadian dollars annually. Given that nearly 77% of Canadian exports are destined for American markets, the tariffs represented a systemic threat to the Canadian economy. Ottawa responded with calibrated retaliatory tariffs on American steel, agriculture, and consumer goods, signaling that Canada would not remain passive under economic pressure. Mark Carney's transition from a high-level central banker to the leader of this movement is central to the current strategy.
Having led the Bank of Canada through the 2008 financial crisis and the Bank of England through the Brexit transition, Carney's approach is rooted in the management of systemic risk rather than traditional political rhetoric. His speech was a calculated set of signals intended to shift national and international expectations. Key among these was a declaration to end the practice of 70 cents of every Canadian defense dollar flowing to American contractors, suggesting a massive reallocation of capital toward domestic industrial policy. This sets the stage for a broader re-industrialization effort focusing on Canadian steel, aluminum, and lumber, aimed at establishing technological and economic sovereignty in an era of heightened geopolitical tension. The core of the current crisis is defined by a significant gap between the government's strategic promises and the existing structural realities of the North American economy. While the Carney administration has signaled a pivot toward domestic industrialization, legal and geopolitical complications present immediate hurdles. A primary concern resides within the Canada-United States-Mexico Agreement, or CUSMA. Under this framework, explicit disciplines exist regarding government subsidies and state support for domestic production. As Ottawa moves to act as the anchor buyer for Canadian steel and lumber, it faces the risk of dispute settlement proceedings. The very legal framework that provides Canada with market access also limits its ability to preferentially finance domestic industries, creating a live tension that the administration's policy platform has yet to publicly resolve. Data indicates that the push for economic sovereignty is being supported by an organic shift in Canadian consumer behavior. Government metrics reveal a 13% increase in visits to national parks and a 15% increase in visits to national museums, alongside 50,000 additional domestic train journeys. These figures suggest that a segment of the population is actively redirecting spending inward in response to the trade conflict. Furthermore, the administration is positioning Canada within a new global trade architecture. Reports indicate that while tensions with Washington escalate, officials in Brussels and London have accelerated talks to expand existing trade frameworks. The European Union has signaled specific interest in deepening cooperation regarding digital trade, critical minerals, and clean energy technology, suggesting that Canada's pivot may involve a calculated repositioning toward European and Asian partners rather than a simple retreat. However, the strategy faces internal resistance from the western provinces of Alberta and Saskatchewan. These regions are responsible for a disproportionate share of national export revenue, particularly in the energy and agricultural sectors, both of which are deeply integrated with U.S. markets. Alberta's energy sector alone accounts for approximately 400,000 jobs and a massive portion of the municipal tax base. Producers in the oil sands have spent decades building infrastructure and contractual obligations oriented toward the south. Similarly, Saskatchewan's agricultural exporters depend heavily on American distribution networks and pricing benchmarks. Under Canada's federal system, provincial governments hold jurisdiction over resource development and trade infrastructure. The premiers of both provinces have expressed public skepticism, noting that a national strategy failing to account for these regional dependencies risks becoming a regional policy rather than a truly national one. The long-term consequences of this strategic realignment are now manifesting across several critical sectors of the Canadian economy, beginning with immediate price effects for consumers. Data from the Bank of Canada indicates that retaliatory tariffs on American goods have led to measurable inflation in consumer electronics and fresh produce categories with high U.S. supply chain exposure. This represents a direct cost of economic independence, as domestic or alternative international substitutes often carry higher price points than traditional American supply chains. In the housing sector, the trade conflict has introduced further volatility. While a slowdown in American foreign direct investment could theoretically cool demand, it has also reduced construction financing and slowed development timelines, sustaining high prices in supply-constrained urban centers like Toronto and Vancouver. In the agricultural and energy sectors, the shift has created significant structural exposure. Saskatchewan canola and wheat farmers are currently making planting decisions for the 2026 season amidst high market uncertainty, which has already led to deferred equipment purchases and reduced input investment. Similarly, the transition for Alberta's energy sector toward Asian markets remains hampered by the time required to build new contractual relationships and Pacific distribution infrastructure. The administrative focus on technological sovereignty is also evident in the National Artificial Intelligence Strategy, backed by a $2.4 billion Canadian dollar commitment. This policy aims to leverage research corridors in Toronto, Montreal, and Alberta to ensure Canada remains a primary actor in global power architecture rather than a secondary observer. The future of the Carney administration's agenda rests on three primary scenarios: the successful transition through careful legal navigation of CUSMA and provincial cooperation, a constitutional confrontation between federal and provincial governments over resource jurisdiction, or a de-escalation of the tariff conflict by Washington that could stall the diversification process. Current leading indicators for analysts include CUSMA dispute filings, European trade negotiation progress, and domestic inflation data over the next 3 quarters. As the government continues to issue forward guidance to shift market expectations, the ultimate success of this pivot will depend on whether the national institutional apparatus can match the speed and scale of the political narrative. For more updates on this developing situation, subscribe to our news service.